interesting. All right, so this presentation is From Film to Page, Translating Cinematic Storytelling Techniques to Novel Writing. I am the writer-director of Greyport, and it's a crime thriller and independent film being shot in Grays Harbor. So I just wanted to spend our time together giving you some tips and ideas to improve your writing by using tools and techniques of filmmakers. All storytellers use the tools available to them, whether it's film, theater, poetry, painting, dance. There's unique things to each form of art of how we tell a story. So some forms use body language and expression and don't have dialogue, and other things have dialogue and no sound. And film is unique in that it combines everything, or just about everything, but novels have a slight advantage is that they oftentimes are better able to get into the characters' heads. So you can talk about the characters' past and their thoughts and their, detailed impressions, and novels have an unlimited amount of time that they can describe fine detail of things, which a film can't do. It doesn't have that luxury, it doesn't have that much time. But they are related. They have a great deal in common, and because they have so much in common, they're frequently borrowing from each other. So best-selling books, as you know, will almost always be created as film stories, and you might not know that popular films are also created as books. There are movies that were created first and then became very popular books, like the Star Wars series of novels, for example. How many of you have seen the movie Adaptation? Anybody? Okay, a couple people. Okay, so for those who haven't seen it, it's a great film. I recommend it. It's by an award-winning screenwriter, Charlie Kaufman. And it's about this exact subject. In Adaptation, the backstory is a Hollywood studio wanted to adapt a book called The Orchid Thief into a hit movie. And this book was a sprawling, lyrical, poetic masterpiece of a novel. And it had almost no plot. And it was kind of impossible to turn into a movie, like a Hollywood-type movie. And Charlie Kaufman was told, here's this big chunk of money, go adapt this book. And he struggled so much with trying to convert it into a screenplay that he actually created a screenplay about that struggle. So the movie Adaptation is about a screenwriter trying to adapt this Orchid Thief novel, which was impossible to turn into a movie, and how he was under pressure from this studio to get paid to do this thing. And it was just this really wild experimental film, and layers within layers, because he made himself a character in the film and gave himself a fictional twin brother that doesn't exist. And then it turned out that the screenplay won the Oscar for Best Screenplay, and he put the name of his fictional or fictional brother in the movie as co-writer of the screenplay. So the whole thing had all these layers, and it was really complex and beautiful. So I definitely recommend that film, and it kind of covers the differences between screen and novels, and the struggle of trying to go between them. So here are some of the things to consider, the differences. So as I said before, films are limited in time, and the reason they're limited is you have to see them all at once in a theater. Ideally, you don't want to interrupt the experience, so people do have to go to the bathroom and they do have to eat, so you can't keep them in a theater logistically for more than 2 to 3 hours max. So films have a set time window because of that. And they have to have popular appeal to succeed, which is very different from a novel. Because films are so expensive to make, you need to have enough people willing to watch it, or the producers to have faith that enough people will be willing to watch it, that it will pay back their millions and millions of dollars invested. And that's created a sort of Darwinian evolution of storytelling techniques, because what works will be used in film over and over, because it's a business and you have to be compelling for the audience. And therefore we can use some of these things in writing more compelling books. So you'll see that in film there's a bias towards continuous action, progression, and lots of plot, clear and ever-present conflict, clear, easy to understand characters, and lots of visual, sound, and spectacle. The other thing about film is that audiences' expectations are to be amazed and blown away buy the film that they're watching because they're paying $15 for, an hour and a half. Whereas a novel doesn't have a limited time window. So there's novels that are over 1,000 pages, and you can take all the time in the world to read it. It can be poetic and go into all kinds of details, and there's no constraint there, really. A novel can have the audience's attention wax and wane. It can have backstories and lots of language and descriptions. It can appeal to a very small audience, have a slow pace, and the audience expectation of a novel is that they will savor the book and that they'll think about it, which is very different from a movie where they just want to be wowed by something.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you written a novel?
I'm actually going to be writing a book version of this screenplay and this film, and that's in progress. So some of what I'm going to be talking about is how you can actually start with using a screenplay almost like an outline and to have a very tight story. And then you can add the poetry into it later, but know that you have a really good spine.
I have to disagree with a lot of that stuff in the genre we write, because none of us would get published.
Right. Well, so that goes to sort of my last point. Like, it's not to say that novelists don't want to be successful or that there's not a barrier to entry to be published by a publisher. But we're in a world of digital publishing where the barrier to entry and the cost is zero.
Right.
So anyone can write a blog, anyone can write an ebook and sell it on Amazon, and it could be extremely, far off center, it could be offensive, it could be crazy, it could be anything. You can publish it online and the cost is zero and you can still, be a novelist. Whereas if you want to be a filmmaker, you can't make a full-length feature film with nothing. Someone has to invest in what you're doing, or you have to put a lot of money into it yourself. So that kind of, that creates the differences, is that in film, there's more of an emphasis on this story has to be compelling. The cost is so high. So what if we borrowed some of those techniques that have been refined in the past 100 years of filmmaking to craft a more compelling novel? And this is what I wanted to get into. So I kind of broke down how a film tells a story into 3 categories. First, you have what I'd call the foundation, which is the screenplay itself. And then the screenplay is turned into an audio storytelling and a visual storytelling. And that foundation, that screenplay, it's not the final product. The director and the cinematographer and the actors add so much to it that you kind of look at it almost like a reference. There's a guide of what the scene should be and what the dialogue should be, but by the time you get to filming, dialogue might be changed or improvised. Whole scenes or whole plots can be cut. So it's not a writer's medium. Like in a novel, the writer, of course, has complete control of what stays. But in a film, it's collaborative and there's a lot of decision makers. There's a visual component, an auditory component, and the screenplay, which is the backbone. And we'll talk about the visual and the screenplay as it would apply to a novel. So some of the visual things are framing the shot, composing the shot, blocking the actors and the action, the lighting, the set design, mise-en-scene, props, wardrobes, costumes, and the makeup. If people already know these terms, I apologize, but framing is how you actually line up the shot, whether it's a wide landscape or whether it's tight close-up on someone's eyes, whether the camera is shaking or the camera is holding still, how the camera moves. We have, words for all of this, different types of movement in film. Doesn't really matter, but we can talk about how even that applies to novels. And composition is things like, is the frame open or closed? So behind the character, do you see an open horizon and a sky and something that's expansive, or do you see just a wall? And that helps tell the story. Is the character boxed in, or do you get a sense of freedom around the character? Blocking is how people move and how the action moves. Is someone walking in front of somebody? Is somebody on top of somebody? Is one person closer to the camera and the other person further away? And the other things I think are probably more self-explanatory. Mise-en-scene is, I found 2 definitions online there. Arrangement of scenery and stage props in a play or a film, or the setting and surroundings of an event or an action. So here's a kind of a better way to think about it. If you think about you're looking at a play or the frame of a film, and two characters are talking, and behind them on the wall there's a shotgun. And it's like framed right in center, and it's very obvious that there's nothing else in the picture, but the shotgun is really clear. You kind of get the sense that at some point that shotgun is going to be important to the story, and it's going to go off. So that's an example of mise-en-scene, of things in the scene that are not people, but that add to the story, add to the tension and to the experience of the story.
So like foreshadowing.
Yeah, it's an example. It can be an example of foreshadowing, but it doesn't have to be just foreshadowing. That's like one of the ways it's used, because it could be, for example, exposition to a character. I have a character in my film who's very old-fashioned, and when we first see his apartment, it has an old typewriter and newspapers and an old film camera and not a voicemail, an answering machine. He has like an old-fashioned answering machine with like little cassette tapes. And so you see all these props, and it tells you something about the character, that he's lost in time, that he's stuck in the past. And so in film, we learn to tell the story through a visual means. We are always warned against being what's called on the nose. Like on the nose is the bad thing that you should never do in a screenplay. You're always told on the nose is being exactly what you're trying to say. So if you said Frank is old-fashioned, that's on the nose. You've just flat out said what it is. But if you show him surrounded by old typewriters and a telescope from the 18th century or something, then you know that he is without being told. And so in a screenplay, you try to do all these things visually. So instead of saying Jack loves Jane, like you might in a novel, if you're sort of a beginning novelist and you just come out and say things. But it's more interesting if you say Jack looked longingly at Jane as she walked away, and when he came home, he reminisced over their yearbook photos. It's showing not telling. And so because you kind of figure out, well, he must love her because he's looking longingly at her, and it involves the audience. They have to sort of they have to fill in the gaps, and that's more compelling. So instead of saying, Mr. Cobblepot was a very wealthy man, as somebody might put in a book, in a film, the screenplay might say, Mr. Cobblepot exited his limousine and looked at his gold watch. And then he's a very wealthy man. You didn't have to have a narrator with a voiceover saying, he's a very wealthy man. You get it. So
MUA.
MUA is makeup artist. So makeup artistry, just special effects, makeup, glamour makeup, anything that has to do with the makeup of the artist. It can be making them look like an alien or making them look really beautiful. It's anything to do with their appearance. So the auditory, I'm not going to cover very much because novels are not geared towards being auditory art forms, but there are things that you can still do in a novel that are auditory. And so this is a famous example that I always thought was quite a beautiful example of rhythm. It's the opening line of Lolita. And if you read it, it has such a clear cadence and a rhythm to it, and how the words are put together to be more musical. And you get a very clear sense of sound, because he's even talking about the sound, Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down to the palate to tap on the teeth. So you have this alliteration, you have this rhythm, and it's sort of an advanced technique. It's not used very much in novels, but you can use rhythm, repetition, which is musical. You can reference a known work of music that your reader, your audience would recognize. And you can note volume and dynamics in a novel. You can say that someone's whispering, or you can change to all caps if they're screaming. Or you can probably even change font size depending on your publishing medium. So there's some auditory things you can do in a novel, even though it's challenging, but sometimes just doing a little bit really heightens a particular scene. So the last of the 3 parts of the film is the foundational script. We talked about some of this already. So action versus dialogue. A filmmaker that a lot of people admire, including myself, Alfred Hitchcock, he was so great because he started in silent films. So he really mastered the showing, not telling. And that's why even when he transitioned to films with dialogue, the camera was always telling you the story. And the dialogue was after that. So yeah, in a script, there should be a biased action versus telling to have a tight, continually moving plot, clearly defined characters. Films don't have a lot of time to develop characters, so we rely on archetypes and stereotypes. And then another great consequence is that is you can break types. So you'll have a character that seems like she's maybe the dumb blonde for the whole movie, and then at the end it's revealed she's really a brilliant evil genius or something. So audiences, when they go to films, they know all these stereotypes of all different kinds of character types. And so we save time, since we only have an hour and a half or 2 hours, to just give people this visual image. She's pretty and she's blonde, so this is what she must be like. This guy is short and has a long hook nose, so he must be a villain. But without being super stereotypical, in a novel, to have a very clearly defined characters is always going to be a plus, because the faster your audience can relate to who they are trying to empathize with, the better. So having a strong sense of what is that character fit into. And action, mystery, suspense, twists and turns and surprises, payoff, resolution, like these are all things that are, of course, used in novels. This is telling a story. A film might do it a little bit differently because it does it through visual means, but I think novels can do all the same thing, and great novels read like blockbuster films. I mean, I don't know if you've picked up, the kind of stuff that I used to read when I was a kid, like Michael Crichton or John Grisham. It would be just bullet points of like, we're at such and such, this is the time, this is the place, so-and-so steps into the, it wasn't poetic. It was just like bam, 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 like a screenplay. And it got you right into the action. So, okay, we went over what these were, and now I want to give examples. These are just still shots from the film I'm working on now to give you a sense of what the different things mean. So framing, like this is an example of framing, how you line up the shot to tell the story.
And why did you use that particular shot in the movie?
Well, so in this shot, it's meant to be mysterious. He's searching for evidence of a crime, and it's referencing an earlier shot where we were watching the same crime, and we were watching the same crime through this angle, but with the people committing the crime. And so when you have a wide shot and a small person in the distance, you feel more like a voyeur. You feel like you're from the outside looking in, and you're peeking through this industrial pipe, and it creates that sense of mystery, of you're spying on these characters.
I'm sorry, what type of story did you say this?
This is a crime thriller, and this is a shot from the film I'm working on, Greyport.
Yeah, no, I was thinking if it was horror, I think there's something in there staring at him.
Well, I mean, there's murder, so murder is a horrific part of a crime thriller. So there's horror elements where you should be spooked, but that's not the entire film, so it's not non-stop horror, but there's horrific moments. So this I picked as an example of composition. Composition, one of the things you look for is an open frame or closed frame, where's the horizon, and clearly this was set up to just give you a sense of the whole landscape and the scale of the people against their environment, that there's this gray, ominous weather and this rain and mud everywhere, and people are sort of dwarfed by their environment and the obstacles in the film. This is an example of lighting, creating mystery when a clue is found in the woods. This is an example of blocking. So you have one character in the shadows in front and one character in the light behind. So your attention naturally goes to the character in the light, but that's not the character speaking. So you're paying attention to the reaction of the detective versus the man telling the story and trying to figure out what happened.
In something on Hitchcock that I saw, they used the example of a desk. They were in the office and they had two, the older man and the younger man across the desk from each other. And their positionings, they would move around it, come close, come apart, step up on kind of a stage he had in his office to show that what he was saying was really all just theater. He didn't plan to go through with it. And they give a beautiful example of that. And I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the movie.
Yeah, that's
Hitchcock was
It was Hitchcock.
unbelievable.
It was an industrial setting.
yeah.
Sorry to
Well,
interrupt.
no, it's great. I mean, he did a lot of things like that. And so in film, you can move the camera, and the camera can be another character, or the audience can be the camera. So the camera can be looking around, you know,
It's almost
sneaking.
like a point of view.
Yeah, it's a point of. It's like so you're always in that fourth wall. You're through the camera looking at the characters. But in most or a lot of films, it's just kept neutral, so that you don't have a sense that you're in the film. But other times it becomes more dynamic. So if there's no characters, or you're just looking at scenery and the camera is wandering around, it's like you're a person walking through that set. You're looking for that clue, or you're staring at the bag of money on the floor because the camera just pointed down, right? And so you have that sense of the fourth wall breaking, and you're in the scene. Unfortunately, not as applicable to novels. So I tried to focus on things we could transfer to book writing. So this is set design. It's just an example of how the set becomes a character, that it informs so much of the scene. So if I had this man sitting at a table at a grocery store deli, it wouldn't give you the same emotional feeling as sitting in this cell. So the way that you make the set look, and in a novel, the way that you would describe the surroundings informs how the audience is going to feel. And that's important to think about. And of course, in film, because we're visual, we always think about that because we see it on camera. And in a novel, it's easy to just be like, well, I don't see it, so it doesn't exist. And that's kind of what I want to challenge you guys on. Mise-en-scene is just an example of some of the props. So we set this up to, check signal cable.
Did it?
Or is it like just tired?
It
Did it go to
may be.
sleep? Or it needs power, juice?
Always helps if you make sure it's plugged in.
Let's see here.
The battery might last.
It should have.
Well,
for
mine
about
does.
6 hours. And it's only been on.
While she's doing that, one of the things that I thought about before is when we talk about framing.
Mhm.
'Cause I know a lot of times that in writing they talk about doing deep POV,
Mhm.
or in other genres, not so much the romance, but there's the omniscient POV,
Yeah.
and I've tried to play with that in my scenes, kind of picturing it as a camera. It's like if
Yeah.
I'm doing a wide shot, I'm going to do more of a omniscient POV. If
Mhm.
I'm doing a super close up, then I'm going to go deep POV and kind of play with that. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we're going to give some excellent examples of how to do things that might not seem very intuitive, but are possible if you're creative in transferring camera things to novel things.
Right, and we're taught in writing to use the descriptive words that set the best tone.
Mhm.
You don't want to just say it's a black room, you want to say it's, okay, I don't think off the cuff.
It's an ebony,
Yeah, it's
an inky blackness, but that's
And
that's
It's a room
right.
full of shadows.
And it's also
Yeah.
supposed to be show, not tell, like
Yeah.
you were saying. We would get slapped, you know, for over explaining if something doesn't belong there.
But you know, it's interesting because in a novel, and this is how, you know, in my own creative life, I tried writing a lot of fiction before I got to filmmaking. And I would always be sort of stuck at, well, gosh, if I'm writing a novel, it has to be this amazing prose and it has to be so poetic. And, you know, maybe I'm not as artful at that, so it creates this resistance. But it actually turns out that many
lot
best-selling
more.
books are not focused on the prose. They're focused on just what's happening.
The action, and like she said, setting the tone and creating, because I do that when I write.
Mhm.
I see the picture in my head. I'm like the camera, and
Yeah.
that's what I see when I write. And I leave a lot of stuff out because
Yeah.
that needs to be there, because I'm like, oh wait, they can't see what's in my head.
Right.
Yeah, and then when I
You
started,
want to put the important stuff in, so
Yes.
yeah,
that would be the, I can't say it right, but I know the word, the mezzanine.
mise-en-scene.
Yeah.
Hey, good picture.
Aw,
I like that.
Thanks. What happened to work?
Yeah, but if you read Agatha Christie or Michael Crichton or, these books that have sold hundreds of millions of copies, they're not necessarily going on about the shadows of the dark inky well of the nether. They're just like, Jack walked into the airport, he saw the limo approaching him with the brief, right? He knew this was going to be important.
Old school.
Yeah, it's just like bam, bam, bam. And there's, it's more like a masculine style of writing, like Jack London, like man saw dog barked at bear.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that kind of freed me up when I saw more examples of that when I started screenwriting. It's like, oh, I don't have to be that poetic. I can actually just focus on the idea and what's the plot and what's the twist and what's the intelligent side of this crafty murder mystery or whatever, the stuff that I really liked, whereas being very flowery and skilled with language, that was more of a barrier to get started. That would create kind of the writer's block versus just going, okay, what happened? What do you see? Who's in the scene? What are they saying? What are they doing? And just put the audience into that space.
That sounds a lot like the first draft.
It can be. It can certainly be like a good first draft.
One of the things we try for in writing novels is getting to the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you perceive that as a filmmaker? How do you try to get the audience to feel what you want them to feel, or do you feel you have any control over that?
Yeah, I have total control over that because that's basically your job as a filmmaker, is that you're playing the audience. You're causing them to feel the emotions you want them to feel. And you do that through a combination of all the different things that I talked about, everything from the scenery to the makeup to the costumes, but most importantly, the actor's performance and the content of the story. So if you have a really powerful story and the actor is believable and compelling in delivering that character's experience. Well, it's a combination of the story and the actor. Like, I think they're equally important. The actor can't give a great performance if they have nothing to do. So you have to have a great story for them to do. But if they're a bad actor, no matter how great the story is, if their performance seems fake, the audience will be tuned out within 10 seconds.
It's your actions, I think, the action tags basically, that's going to carry that story, and what they say is that convinced, whatever they're doing at that time.
Yeah, you want to be completely convinced that what's happening is real. That's the goal of the performance. You could have terrible backdrops and really cheap sets and bad special effects and weird sound, but if your actor, when they're crying, feels to the audience that they're really broken down and that's real, then the audience will feel compassion and say, wow, that was a great film. But if you have amazing special effects and hundreds of millions of dollars thrown at the screen and your actors are wooden or they have no chemistry, people are falling asleep. Okay, mise-en-scene. It was different props and things in this shot that we added to tell the story of the character, her pink little rotary phone and her fuzzy feathered pen and all these little things. You can do that in a novel, describe things that relate to the character. Props, anything the characters use or have. This was a photo of a mysterious woman that half the film revolves around. Costumes. So, costumes can give you information too. So in this case, this is the sudden sidekick to the detective. And the detective comes to visit him to give him some information, and he's wearing this serial killer t-shirt as a joke with a spoon. But, maybe you never know. Maybe there's a little something there, foreshadowing. So you can use a costume to tell a story as well. Makeup, so we made this obviously entirely fake, but using makeup. And let's see. Okay, so these are just some other examples. I was going to open it up to you guys to discuss, like, what are the techniques used here. So if you want to just call things out.
The framing and or the composition.
Yeah, framing, composition, lighting. There's some blocking because one guy's on the ground looking at the evidence, the other guy's behind him, sort of like looking around for more. Okay, so what do we have here?
Same thing, blocking.
Yeah, blocking, lighting, composition. I mean, those are pretty much going to be throughout a film if it's done thoughtfully, if they're not just pointing at whatever. Here as well, like, I mean, this is, maybe a stronger example of blocking, that you see one person's face and you don't see the other person's face, like, who are we focusing on? Another example with more blocking.
Yeah.
I wish I could do like video clips, but I just have the stills. But you can imagine this gentleman walking through the shot surrounded by his security guards. And so there's a very strong sense of composition that he's flanked by these people, and they're all in black. And the puddles reflecting everything nicely. Now this is kind of interesting. You can do this in a novel as well. You can be looking through things to be a voyeur. So it's a very powerful film technique. It's used a lot. Keep that one in mind.
In novels, however, for our,
Mm-hmm.
it has to be in the primary character seeing that. So is this omniscient, or would this be somebody is watching, not just the?
You can be omniscient. You can just have it in the description. You can say, like, if I were to put this in the novel, I'd say Officer Hall and Frank Blakely were talking through the door of the office, seeing through whatever, describing it, and not specify that I'm a character, and just say.
If you were writing another genre, that would work. Romance,
Yeah, not
you
for
really
us.
can't.
We could not do that.
Yeah, there has to be a character
There has-
watching.
Could you see in our genre?
Could you say that through the leaves of the trees, Jack and
if it's a
Jill were?
person
But what if there
watching,
wasn't a person? You just open the chapter and say, through the leaves of the trees,
that's
Jack and
literary,
Jill.
not genre fiction.
Well, break the rules.
Don't get published.
Publish yourself. Okay, so just more composition examples. So moving to our actual techniques. So my premise is with the presentation that every visual tool and technique that I use as a filmmaker, that filmmakers use in cinema, can be replicated in book form with just a few exceptions. And I'll show you how and why this is possible, even though you might not believe it at first. But the reader is actually always forming a mental image in their mind. So it's like they already have a mental projector screen. There's already a movie going.
Yeah.
It's just if you don't cue them in, the movie's going to be whatever they want to imagine.
Right.
And so you can dictate with certain cues of certain words and certain use of language, whether they're in a wide shot or a close-up shot, whether they're looking down at the characters or up at the characters or how big the characters are, all those different things. It's just might not be as intuitive to do from, say, like a first draft. But it's a very powerful idea. So this is an exercise. So like if we were going to put this shot from a Hitchcock movie, I think this is from Vertigo, I'm pretty sure. If you're going to put this as a description in a novel, and this movie didn't exist, but this was the picture in your head, right? And this is what you imagine the character doing, could you describe it and make the audience see that when they read your book?
You could.
You probably could. And so like here's an example that I just wrote. Looking down at the old winding staircase, it was a horrifying, spiraling marvel that seemed never-ending and leading nowhere. He stared down at the old wooden steps, cobbled together without railings, surrounded by rough stone prison walls, and descended, slowly shaking, unsure of his grip or his step, hypnotized by the abyss below, cautious and frightened. Dwarfed in the shadows by the steps that consumed everything, went on and on and on down into forever, spinning out of control in his mind. So that tries to capture what you see in Vertigo. And you might not write this way if you didn't have a very clear example of a visual. You might just say, he was trembling and the staircase seemed to go on forever, right? Or he was scared and it was a spooky place or something. But when you have such a clear image and you have the sequence, watching it from Hitchcock and how he put it together visually, and that informs the language and capturing all the details, how rickety things were, how old the steps, how the walls were very solid and he felt like he couldn't escape. So that all goes into the description. And it's just to show that if you have a clear picture first, the writing becomes better. Yeah. So then for the next example, what do you see when you would read the following? This is like going the other direction. Her mouth, huge, screaming, then stab, slash. Suddenly the man in the shadows exposed behind the curtain, only his flashing blade visible. Soft, wet skin, horrified, shrieking screams, flashed to the knife so quick the shadow came at her. Oh, but her horror! Her wet, screaming face, she turned and squirmed helpless as the knife cut under the waterfall of water, blood pooling at the drain until the screams were heard no more.
Psycho.
Psycho, yeah.
Psycho, and I've never even seen it.
So imagine if this was in your head, you had like the scene going, the movie didn't exist, and you wrote this in a novel. People would see that same sort of imagery that Hitchcock created. But you wouldn't intuitively think to write like this because it's not poetic necessarily, it's not grammatically perfect. It focuses on the rhythm of the cuts. It focuses on the close-ups of what you see, the flash of the knife, the man in the shadows. And it actually covers some of the framing, like her mouth huge. So you start with like this close-up of a screaming mouth. Things like that. So it's interesting that you can create these pictures. So this is the scene, and that's what was described with the words. And it's a fun exercise to practice this. Like you can pick a favorite scene you like from a movie, write it out how you'd put it in a novel, and then maybe have a friend that hasn't seen it read it and play them the scene and see if they pictured what you wrote or if there were differences. Like that's a good sort of exercise to develop that skill and see how well we can actually have similar images, that we all have sort of similar reference points, and we can manipulate the audience into seeing what we want them to see even when there's no visual because it's all words. So tips for using the visuals in novels is try drawing storyboards, at least for key scenes. Imagine you're directing the film version of your book and be really clear on what you want the audience to picture, and then write your description according to your storyboards. So if you do like little stick figure sketches of like, okay, well he's gonna be really tiny and it's gonna be a bleak, mountainside and he's struggling against the elements. And then we're gonna have a close-up of like his chapped lips and his beard growing because he's struggling to survive. And you kind of put it out, like frame it like it's a movie, and then rewrite the scene using those images and see what you come up with. And it might be, might combine it with what you had before, might add more prose and more lyrical style, but it will be compelling to your reader because they'll see these images. They'll be very clear in their heads, just like we showed with the examples from Hitchcock. Okay, and using screenwriting techniques in novels. So this is not the visual side of film, but like the actual script side of film. Many best-selling books naturally use screenwriting techniques, like a lot of the popular page turners from Stephen King and Grisham, Michael Crichton, Dan Brown, etc. They have a bias to action, a lot of plot and adventure, high stakes, cliffhangers, twists and turns, mystery, suspense. They start with a bang. They often explore some sort of outlandish, fantastical, unbelievable premise that grabs the reader and doesn't let go until there's some kind of spectacular resolution. And in film, this is known as a high concept film if it's done with a film. So like I was at a store the other day and I was looking at the backs of the paperbacks, and like I remember this paperback was talking about this female detective who was on the case to catch the serial killer, and all the clues pointed to the fact that it was her own husband. And it had, all this other description of what was going on, but I thought, that's so outrageous, right? Like you'd think that couldn't possibly happen in real life. And the whole thing was like, well, she has to save her marriage and catch the guy, but she's sure it's her husband. And oh boy, what will she do? And so it's this idea of like something really outlandish that you think that couldn't possibly, that's just wild.
Was
but
she blonde?
yeah, right? But that's what grabs people, is like if you had a movie like that, if it was like, oh, she's got to catch a serial killer, but then she finds out it could be her husband, what will she do? Like, people would watch that movie just because, like, holy crap, what's going to happen? That makes no sense. I want to see how they pull this off. A high concept example is like Air Force One, where the plot of that is the president is trapped on his own airplane when terrorists take over and get rid of his security team, and then he has to take the terrorists down one by one in hand-to-hand combat, right? And it's like, that's insane, he's the president, but it sounds really fun. And then, Harrison Ford gets to be this badass president. And the movie makes tons of money because of the concept, because the concept is so shocking and interesting. It seems outlandish, but you want to know how it turns out. So the last point here is that a lot of the best-selling novels eliminate flowery prose and many of the intricacies of language and descriptive detail in order to get straight to the point and paint a strong visual picture, just like blockbuster films do.
Unless you win an Oscar.
Unless you
Then
win an
have to
Oscar,
buy these
then you
boring
have to.
novels.
Well, see, and it's funny because the films that make the most money, they usually appeal to the primal emotions like fear or lust or something like that. Like, so Jaws is like, or Jurassic Park. But then the films that win Oscars are more complex intellectual emotions like regret, you know, or melancholy. And it's just not as compelling to people as I gotta survive the shark attack, right? To think about regretting the loss of your childhood love or something. But it can make for a beautiful, you know, poetic, thoughtful film, just not as big of an audience. So you'll have a smaller budget. The budget will be adjusted accordingly. Yeah, and so no surprise when those types of novels that are written that way, like the Crichton books and Stephen King books and things, are turned into movies. Okay, so this is fun. This is an example of what I was talking about. This is an example of what I was talking about, saying that I'm going to be turning the film into a novel version. So it will actually be a film first. But if I think about it, it's like the first thing is the idea. The first thing is really I have characters and I have a story, and the idea is this world that I'm in my head. And so whether I make it a book or I make it a film or I make it an opera, it's still the same idea. So the film came first, and the book will come second, but nonetheless, you know, you're just taking the same thing and slightly shifting it. So this is page 1 of my script. This is script format, what it looks like. It says, exterior, woods, muddy road, blue hour. So you can see we get straight to the point in film. Don't even use filler words there. Dark woods are hauntingly beautiful under a vivid blue twilight sky. As a low-hanging fog drifts over late autumn landscape, police car with lights flashing pulls in at the end of an old logging road, and 2 officers step out, flash beams cutting through the mist.
So why do you have all caps for dark woods, twilight
Yes.
sky, lights flashing?
So in screenplay format, things that must be considered for your different departments, that you put them in all caps so that they're easy to recognize. So like your props department is like, oh, we need a flashlight, or we need to have fog, or
Okay.
yeah. So that's it's not like you're yelling Twilight, right? It's to tell the cinematographer you have to plan to shoot this at a certain hour.
Okay.
So it's just that you know, I don't make up the format, but those are some of the rules that we follow. Like if it's a sound effect, it needs to be in all caps.
Okay.
Things like that. So the nude corpse of a young woman is revealed face down in the mud. Her head is turned to the side, face covered by long tangled hair. Officer Hall, shit, not again. Officer Hall walks forward slowly. His young partner approaches the body first and lifts her hair out of the mud before Hall can stop him. God damn it, don't touch anything. It's too late, and the young cop recoils horrified, throwing up in the bushes. He coughs and his hands shake. So that's the whole first scene, is that they find a dead woman in the woods. The rookie cop pulls up her hair and sees something terrible and throws up. So it's following the rule of, showing, not telling. We don't open with a narration or a news person saying, there's been a bunch of murders in this town. We have a murder, and then we have the cop saying, oh no, not again.
Right.
So, and then we don't say, oh, it was really terrible, she looked awful. We have the guy throwing up. So again, it's showing, not telling. And then this would be the novel version. And it's very close. The dark woods were hauntingly beautiful under a vivid blue twilight sky. As low fog drifted over the autumn landscape, a police car, lights flashing, entered this forgotten place. It stopped at the end of an old logging road as 2 solemn officers, one older, one younger, stepped out, their boots crunching over the dried leaves, their flashlight beams cutting through the misty fog. They searched diligently without speaking for an hour until the older one spotted suddenly through the thick undergrowth the nude corpse of a young woman down in the mud. Her head was turned and her long dark hair covered her face. The older officer cursed and shook his head. Not again, he muttered to himself, as the young rookie approached the body. Before he could stop him, the kid had lifted her hair and saw what the murderer had done. God damn it, he yelled at the rookie, don't touch anything. But it was too late, and the kid, shaking like a leaf over the sight of her, was throwing up in the bushes. Jane Doe had no face left. So you can see, like, it's very, very close. There's a little more description. We get to say things like they crunched over the autumn leaves, or they searched without talking for an hour. But I didn't have to do that much to convert it from the screenplay format, change it into paragraphs and get rid of all those annoying all caps things that you have to do with film. But it's much simpler to do this from a screenplay than to sit down and just write this at the start. If I think in terms of the visual and I think in terms of like, okay, what's the action, what's the dialogue, and that's it, and then I have that, and I have the backbone of the whole story, and then I go, okay, well, let me add a little bit more description, then it comes together. But if I just start with like, an outline of note cards and going, there's a murder and they find her in the woods, and I try to go from that to this, I'll be procrastinating a long time. So tips for screenwriting techniques in novels is try writing a quick draft version of your book or a chapter in screenplay format. And you don't have to know all the silly details about what's in caps and what's not. You can just go, okay, in screenplay format, I basically say a sentence for the action, and then I say the dialogue, who's the character speaking and what's the dialogue, and then the action and who's the character speaking and what's the dialogue. And it just goes back and forth from that for the entire 90 or 120 pages. Just action, dialogue, action, dialogue.
90 to 120 pages, 2 hours?
90 is 90 minutes, 120 is 2 hours. So in screenplay format, the reason we have the weird margins and center columns for dialogue and all that stuff is that was designed to make it 1 minute film for 1 minute of screenplay, or 1 page of screenplay. And they came up with that back in the olden studio days, and it's pretty accurate, surprisingly accurate how it works out to a minute per page. So other tips is eliminate prose and cut the description down to the minimum to tell the story through as much action and dialogue as you can. Eliminate scenes or events that don't move the plot forward. You'll hear that all the time when people look at screenplays or critique screenplays, is like, if that scene doesn't do anything, maybe it just describes the character, or you thought it was funny or whatever, if it's not moving the plot, just cut it and do that funny thing or describe the character in tandem with some action. Continually build your tension. Craft twists and turns and obstacles for your main characters until a resolution seems impossible. So suspense is basically not resolving the problems, not resolving the tension. The longer that you can not resolve the tension and continually make it worse and not get to a resolution, the more suspense your film has. And the more suspense it has, the more the audience is hooked in and they must get to the ending. So it's the same way with a page-turning novel. Like when people say, oh, it's such a page-turner, it's because they never resolve anything. They have a whole chapter of things getting worse, and then it ends on a cliffhanger. You're like, well, what the heck happens next? And you read the next chapter, and things just keep getting worse, and then it's another cliffhanger, and you can't put the darn thing down because you never get an answer until you're at the very last chapter. So it's, kind of a dirty trick, but it works. It works in our psychology. Surprise your audience with a conclusion that seems perfectly fitting, but at the same time surprising. So you think there can't possibly be a resolution, and then you come up with one, but it's a twist. It's something that they didn't expect, but yet it works because you set up little clues that this could happen. You have to justify it. And lastly, just take the screenplay version, which is a tight 90 or 120 pages, reformat and expand it with more description and prose to have a compelling book. So that's the example I gave from that first scene is if I just did that with every scene in the screenplay, I'd end up with, a 200-page book or something, and it would just be adding to what I had. So that's it. Now we're at questions. But yeah, in screenwriting, we don't count the word count at all. We just count the page count if it's formatted properly. And so 90 pages is your minimum, but you don't want to go over 120, then it's not producible, because nobody wants a film over 2 hours. And films, of course, they're so expensive. Like every minute you shoot, that's another 100,000 or whatever. So it's like if you can make it 90 minutes and just sort of hit the minimum, that's the easiest to produce. So yeah, that tends to be what sells as far as like if you're a screenwriter.
Is there a X number of scenes in 90 and 120 pages? Are you, I mean, can you fit
Tons.
as many scenes as you want in screenplay writing?
Well, I mean, I can't say, I mean, you couldn't fit 1 million, but if you could have 3 scenes in 1 page. They would just be really short.
Yeah.
So it all depends on how fast you want to cut, because the 90 pages is, you know, an hour-and-a-half film, and you look at different films, they have different kinds of pacing. Like some films are like, people will say 2 lines, you cut to the next scene, people say 2 lines, you cut to the next scene. It's like very dynamic that way. Other films, you'll have a scene where people are having a long domestic argument and it's like 6 minutes long and they're going all over the house and whatever, and it's a very slow, languid pace. So it depends on what the storyteller wanted to do with the rhythm, but you can fit as many as, you know, you can fit in that, that you can speak that many lines or whatever, cut that many times and still have it make sense. Like you're not going to cut someone saying 1 word, but you can have a scene where it's 1 sentence, you know, someone screams at somebody and then you cut away. So in my film, in Greyport, we have, well, it sort of depends on what you count as a scene. Like I had counted certain establishing shots as a scene because of how what it required to film them, but it's not truly a scene, it's just like the opening shot. So it's around like 125 scenes, and the script is very close to that. It's like 124 pages. So it's about a scene per page. So it does cut quite a bit, but you have a page of people talking and exchanging information before you cut away. But I didn't want it to drag to where, you know, like we're going to have a 10-minute conversation about this body that we found. It's like, well, here's the facts, and then let's move on. There's a lot to get to. So, yeah. So any other questions about film or applying it?
So, are you in school now?
No.
Okay. So what? I'm just curious of your background.
Well, I started, as far as film, I started film work. Actually, I was lucky enough to do it in high school. I went to Bellevue High School, and they had a media program. So that was like a 2-hour-a-day class that I did for 2 years, for my junior and senior year. And then I took a break after I got out of high school, and then a few years later I came back to just volunteering in indie film in the Seattle area, and just volunteered on tons and tons of stuff and learned all the different positions. And you know, went through things in life and went through a relationship and different jobs, and I got to a point where I really wanted to tell my own story. And I was getting my apartment freed up. My ex was moving out, and I had an idea for a story to shoot at my apartment, and created a set out of this apartment. Yeah, and lived in this set, which was a very grungy, like it was supposed to be this condemned building, and we had great fun trashing this apartment and less fun cleaning it up. So I made my first short film. I wrote it, I directed the actors, and I edited it in post-production, and I took it to film festivals. And that was an awesome experience. And that kind of got my foot in the door with doing paid work in Seattle film, not just volunteering as like the girl who gets the pizza or whatever. Well, I was doing other things, like it wasn't my full-time job, but I'd always been interested in media, whether it was shooting video or doing photography. And I ended up in Aberdeen for like a summer break, and I was actually going to work on writing. I was going to try to work on a book. You know, I've just always been very creative, and I had these stories, and I didn't think in terms of medium, I just thought in terms of my stories. After a couple of months, I was like, well, I'm kind of lonely, I don't know anyone out here, I'll go meet the other filmmakers, because that's what I did in Seattle. There'd be like a coffee shop where all the indie filmmakers went, And I quickly found out when I tried to go out to the coffee shops and meet people, they're like, there are no filmmakers here in Aberdeen, right? Like, we're a town of like 10,000 people. You're the one filmmaker here. But they got very excited that I was the one filmmaker there. And they're like, well, if you want to make a film, we'll help you. And so it became this kind of, the snowball effect of the camaraderie of people getting excited. And, you know, there's not much to do. So everyone thought doing a film would be fantastic and exciting. And then as word spread, I actually had local government leaders come to us, come to auditions for our film where we had no budget and no script, but we were just like, this will be cool. Let's just audition some people and see who we like. And we had like, you know, city council members and people who owned law firms and were, you know, city leaders come to us and to these auditions and try for a part, and then afterwards just very humbly say, well, you know, if you need anything, I'm the president of the city council. I can get you locations, whatever you need. And I'd be like, holy cow. So we did get sort of the golden keys to the town of both Aberdeen and Hoquiam, which is next door.
You didn't say, shit, goddammit, not now. I love that.
No, I was thrilled. I thought
Yeah,
that,
that's awesome.
yeah, it was like sort of an opportunity that I'm like, well, this would never happen in Seattle. Like the mayor of Seattle doesn't come to you and go, you know, I'm not going to charge you permit fees or insurance, just a handshake deal. Shoot whatever you want that the city owns. We just want to get the exposure for Seattle, right? They're not interested. It's going to cost a fortune. So Aberdeen and Hoquiam, they wanted to be on screen and to be promoted to audience. So they were very favorable. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to get all these locations for free, so don't want to pass up the opportunity. Let's make a real film. Let's not do like a short film or like a little small thing. Let's do a full-length feature with like, let's just make it big. And it's kind of like the happy naivete of not knowing what you're doing, because I'd never made a feature film before. I'd only done like a 15-minute short. And we didn't even have a script, and I'd never written a feature-length script before either. So like I just like, oh, we'll knock it out. 6 weeks later, we'll just have a script, and that's not how it happened. So we've been at it with a lot of volunteers, and we've overcome most of those obstacles, and we've been at it for the past few years, and hoping that this will be the final year in production. But yeah, it was a journey. It was part of that journey of like I got the opportunity, and I decided to step up to the plate, and all these things that I'm showing you, like the visuals and the composition, like I'd never been behind the camera before, ever. But I had a good eye because I'd done photography and I did oil painting, a lot of oil painting. I have a visual arts degree. So I just applied that to camera, but I had to learn all the technical things about lighting, about exposure, you know, time of the day, all sorts of things. But I just thought, well, if I don't try, like in order to learn, you have to make mistakes. So you just have to expect that you're going to screw up a lot, and eventually you'll get it. And so it's been a learning process, and I was excited to do it because of how I would grow and what it would make of me to do a project on that scale. So that's what happened, and now we have, you know, a lot of amazing footage, and we're getting close to the end. We see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I've learned so much about storytelling and working with people and being involved in the community. So it's great, and I'd say that about any work of art or anything you do in life is you get out of it what you put into it.
Right, yeah.
As much as you commit yourself to being better, it will pay back. So that's the presentation. Anybody have any other questions?
When do you think your movie will come out, and will it be showing here in town?
Well, we don't know because we're not done shooting it, so I don't know a release date. I can send you guys the link to our page, sending out the link to the presentation if you'd like, because we have a Facebook page, and we have an IMDb page now as well.
Oh,
and
Congratulations.
yeah, thanks. And we have a monthly newsletter we send to people who are fans or that are involved that just gives them kind of a behind the scenes of here's what we shot this month, you know, here's some behind the scenes stuff. So we have that as well if anybody wants to keep up with it. Yeah, so we don't know the release date, and we don't know the date that we'd finish shooting because it's all volunteers, and you know, everyone has a life and stuff happens, as I've learned.